Are you tired of getting forked and blundering winning positions? In today's video, we're going to discuss everything you need to know about knight endgames. Knight versus different passed pawns, as well as known patterns and tactical ideas to save or win certain positions. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. So first things first, let's discuss knight versus passed pawn positions. So in this case, black has a passed pawn on g2. It's about to promote. White has a knight on h3 that is blocking the promotion square. Not blocking, but controlling the promotion square. If the pawn promotes, white will simply capture. White's king is far away. Black's king is very, very close. So is this position winning for black, or is this a draw? We know that white can't win because a single knight is unable to checkmate. However, black could potentially make a queen and checkmate white if the king gets close, but it is not possible when you're in a situation like this. In this case, white's knight has a vision on this promotion square and it can straight up also go there. Let me just make a move like king to b7. Let's say this king tries to get close. Our opponent will try to get close to our knight. If we just continue to bring the king, the knight will eventually go to g1, and it doesn't matter where the black king goes. If the black king goes to h2, we will give a check on f3. If the black king comes back, we will return to the promotion square. We will do the same thing if the king goes this way. The king goes to f2. In this case, we give a check. If the king stays on f1, okay, fine. Now we can bring the white king. But if the king attacks the knight, once again, we go to the promotion square. And these positions where knight is against a passed pawn is always going to be a draw if it is a knight's pawn, bishop's pawn, or any of the central pawns. So the highlighted squares right now, if this pawn was on any of the highlighted squares, this position would be a draw, provided the knight is in front of the pawn. The rook's pawn is the only one that is super tricky, and we're gonna get into that right now. So whenever our opponent has a rook's pawn and it is on the second rank and it is very close to promotion, the position is losing if the white king is far away. So in this position, black king is attacking the knight on g3. The knight has to go somewhere. Only square to not allow queening is on h1. However, here the issue is that after king to f3, this knight has no squares to go to. If it goes to g3, it gets taken. If it goes to f2, it also gets taken. And the problem is, if it does nothing, then the black king will get closer. It's going to scoop up this pawn and it's going to promote in a couple of moves. So the rook's pawn is knight's greatest enemy. Let me show you yet another position, but let me show you a little bit of a different position here. So in this case, if we play a very natural looking move, which is knight to g3, we lose the game because of the same idea. Either h2, king e1, king f2, or even king e1 right away and then king to f2 right away wins the game here because the knight is once again stuck in the corner. But going back, there is a very interesting defensive resource here, and that is knight to e3 check. After king to f2, we go to g4. And remember, I told you, if the black pawn, if the rook's pawn is on the second rank, the position is lost. However, if the pawn is on the third rank, the position actually becomes a draw, and I will show you the drawing technique. Let's say the king goes to this f3 square, we give a check on h2. The king goes to g3, we give a check on f1. The king goes over here to g2, once again we give a check, and we just simply keep going back. But there is one single trick that you have to know. Let's say in this position, king to g3 is played. There is only one move that draws the game, and that move is knight to e3. And even though it is not a check, you need to remember that if the pawn is ever pushed, knight to f1 is a fork, and after king g2 we sacrifice the knight for the pawn, and the position is once again a draw. And let me show you yet another position. This position is still a draw despite the fact that the pawn is on the second rank, and that is because in this case knight is creating sort of a natural barrier against the black's king. So first and foremost, it is controlling both e2 and e4, so the king cannot go there. It also cannot go to e3 because if it goes to e3, let me move the king. If it goes to e3, there is a knight to f1, simply winning the pawn here. So these three squares are completely covered. The white king is too close, so all of these squares are going to be covered. If the king goes up, this square on e5 is also going to be covered. So all of these squares here are pretty much covered, either directly or tactically. Same goes for this square on d2. So knight to f1, would be able to fork the king and the pawn, and the position would still be a draw. So the only way for black king to advance is to sort of take this route over here to the knight, and that takes a long time. I'm not gonna lie, that takes a very, very long time, and by the time the king gets over here, I mean, it's not going to get over here. Never mind. It's never going to get over here. The white king is going to come back in time and stop this pawn. So this is sort of one of those positions that is an exception. If the pawn is on the second rank and if it's a rook's pawn, the position is going to be a draw for the side that has the knight. But if it's a normal case, such as this one right here, the rook's pawn is knight's greatest enemy. Okay, let me give you guys a fun fact about chess. So in chess, the knight is the only piece that cannot triangulate, which means that you get funny situations like this, where the king is stuck in the corner, for example, and after king to f7, this position is actually a draw. As disgusting as this looks, this position is actually a draw. That is because even if you bring the knight over here, it doesn't matter how many checks you give, the king is going to keep going back and forth on f8 and f7, and there is absolutely no way you can like go around with this knight in order to win here. Like there's just simply no chance of you ever winning this position. However, if we actually change the positioning of the pieces just a little bit, let's say this position right here, now the position is winning for the white pieces because the knight is placed in the correct place, and after a move like king to f8, let's say knight to f6, and after king to f7, we go knight to d7, and the knight is controlling this f8 square, and this position is completely lost because you have to take your eye off of the g8 square, and after king g8, white simply queens. So this position right here is a draw, but this position right here is a win. It depends on the placement of the knight in relation to the king. So as long as you get the right configuration, this position might end up being a draw, and you might be able, or this position right here, sorry, you might be able to draw this position right here. So let's use this idea in the following position. In this case, the position is winning for the white pieces. Why is that? Okay, after king to f6 here, black does not have a lot of moves. Let's say g5 is played, right? White would go knight to g4 here, giving a check. Only legal move is king to h1, and now you play king f1. Once again, the only winning move. This forces the pawn to h2 because the king cannot go there. This pawn is blocked, so the only legal move in the position is h2, and now black simply gets checkmated. Okay, now let's talk about this position right here, and this is of course a winning position for the white pieces. What white would do here is simply bring the king, and after a couple of moves, what will happen is that after a move like king to g8, let's say we can literally just move the knight around a little bit, and then we can promote this pawn to the queen and checkmate the black king. So this is a very routine win for the white pieces, and I want you guys to keep this position in mind. The pawn is on h6. This is the beginning position right here. The pawn is on h6 and the knight is on f5. However, if we change the position a little bit, let me just change it right here. All I did was move the pawn and the knight one square up. Now this position is a draw. So you do not want to have the pawn on the 7th rank. You actually want your pawn to be at least one square behind, and you want to lead the charge with the king and with the knight. So you do not want to be pushing pawns this far up. And the reason is, if you bring the king here, what black will do is simply just go back and forth with king g7 and king h8. And the problem is the knight cannot be moved. If the knight is ever moved, the pawn will simply get taken, and if the king comes closer in order to defend the pawn, now the position is a draw due to stalemate. So you can actually end up in funny situations like this, where even though you're up a pawn and the knight is defending the pawn right here, the position is actually a draw. This is not winning for the white pieces, so make sure to not push your pawns too far up. Instead of that, keep your pawns behind and lead the charge with the king and with the knight. This also works in king and pawn endgames, and I will actually talk about that right now. Okay, now I want to talk about a couple of key principles that are relevant in knight endgames, and principle number one is going to be the fact that if a pawn endgame is winning, that means that if you throw in two knights in there, it is also usually going to be winning, because pawn endgames and knight endgames are very, very similar. So in this position, white is up a pawn, the a pawn. The pawn on a4 is an extra pawn for the white pieces, and if you were to simply push this pawn to a5 and then go c4, b5, and a6, you would create a passed pawn and you would be able to win the game with the white pieces. That means that if we throw in two knights in here, if this was the position, this position right here is also winning for the white pieces, because knight endgames, as I said, are very similar to pawn endgames, and here the winning process would be very similar. Maybe it is just a little bit more complex because the knight is going to try to defend against the pawns. However, in this position, you would still go a5, you would still go like knight to d6, hitting the pawn, you would still push the pawns, and the whole process of winning this endgame would be the same as winning a king and pawn endgame. You would just try to push the pawn, create a passed pawn, and then win the game. So remember, knight endgames are the closest to pawn endgames. So principle number two is going to be the fact that the king dominates the knight if it stands one square away from the knight diagonally and two squares away from the side, either horizontally or vertically. So in a position like this, let me just go back to the beginning position. Black is giving a check to the white king. Where do you go with the white king here? Of course, you don't want to block the pawn, so those two options are immediately out. You cannot go to c7, knight controls that. You don't necessarily want to go to c6 either, because you can be checked. And why would you do that when you can avoid getting checked right away? If you go to b7. So when you stand on b7, you control all the knight jumps, all the forward knight jumps, because the knight wants to try to stop this pawn right here, and you're disallowing the knight to jump to the squares that would control the promotion square. So you're not allowing the knight to advance, and if the knight were to go somewhere else, first of all, it cannot go to b4. The white knight is the one controlling that, and if it were to jump to e7, it is now two squares away from the king horizontally, and it is still dominated. And this is the perfect positioning for the king when it comes to actually fending off this knight, because the knight cannot jump forward, and also it cannot check the king right here. It cannot check the king from this square either, because it's one square away diagonally. So remember, king dominates the knight one square away diagonally, two squares away either horizontally or vertically. So principle number three is going to be to deflect the knight away in order to promote your pawn. So in a lot of cases, if you're in a knight endgame, you might run into a scenario like this. It is white to move, and if white makes a queen, knight to g6 is a fork, and this will simply lead to a draw, such as in a position like this. However, you have a very, very clever way to defend against this if you play this move, knight to d7 check. Knight d7 forks the knight and the king, so something has to be done here. Once the knight captures, now white can simply queen, and now the position is winning for the white pieces. We know that the queen versus the knight is a winning endgame. So let me show you yet another example of something like this. Let's take a look at this position right here. Same tactic. We go knight to g7 check. We deflect the knight away, because if we push the pawn, we lose the pawn, and then the position becomes a draw. But if we go knight g7 check first, now knight has to take, and after a move like h6, if the knight moves away anywhere, it doesn't matter where, we simply queen in two moves. And if the king tries to get close in hopes that we take the knight and then blunder a draw, we actually don't take the knight, we push the pawn through, and on the next move, white is able to queen because the knight is blocking the king's way, which is kind of funny here. This is a very rare sort of a pattern though, but it can happen from time to time. The king cannot go to g8, it cannot go to g7. If it goes to g6, well, now we simply make a queen. So now I want you guys to solve one position right here. So let me just simply go to the next position. It is this one right here. Position is white to move. Pawns are going up. So the white pawns are going up, black pawns are going down. So you have to use this idea of deflection to try to solve this puzzle. I will give you guys 3 seconds to pause the video and try to solve this puzzle if you want to. 3, 2, 1. The solution to this puzzle is this move knight to e7. If we push the pawn right away, what happens is that black will simply play knight to d7, and let's say now we try to move the knight away, black knight will go to f6. And I want you guys to notice that this f6 square is a very crucial square in this position. So in this case, we cannot push the pawn. We have to start by making this move right here, knight to e7. Black will still try to do the same thing. Black will try to go to d7 in order to try to go to f6. However, in this case, we have this amazing knight to c6 check, and after king to b6, we have this amazing deflection, knight takes e5. If knight captures, we simply make a queen, g7, g8. But if the knight follows through with his plan, he plays knight to f6. Now we have this amazing move, knight d7, a second deflection. And here the black knight has to capture. Okay, but how do we stop the knight from accessing f6? If we push the pawn, knight will go back to f6, and then the queening is stopped. So instead of going g7, we have to play this amazing move, e5. Taking away the f6 square from the knight, and after knight captures on e5, a g7, and on the next move g8, a queen wins the game for the white pieces. Even though black has so many pawns, these pawns are going to get swept up by the queen, and white is simply going to be winning in this position right here. It is still a difficult endgame. It's not exactly a cakewalk, but it is a winning position, and I will let you guys do the analysis on your own here if you want to look at this position and figure out how this position is winning for the white pieces. The link to this study is going to be in the description. Principle number 4 is going to be to try to trap the opponent's knight. Knight is the most awkward piece in chess, and because it's so awkward, it can easily get trapped even if it is out in the open like this right here. So this position is white to move, and the correct move in this position is this move, knight to b3. And now what I want you guys to notice is that the black knight has 4 legal moves. It can go to a5, c5, and it can go to d6 and d8. However, all of these squares are controlled either by the white knight or the white king. That means that the knight is stuck on b7, and the white king can simply go king d7, king c7, and then scoop up this knight on b7. That is why in a lot of rook versus knight positions, we say to keep the king and the knight close, because if the king and the knight are close, it's harder to trap the knight. It's harder to separate these two pieces. So there are kind of similarities because of how awkward the knight is. So in this case, try to trap the knight as much as possible. And finally, principle number 5 is going to be the fact that if you have more material and you're trying to push a position for a win, you need to keep as many pawns on the board as possible. So in a position like this, there are pawns on both sides of the board, both king side and queen side, and white is up a pawn. This position is easily winning for the white pieces. You would just do the typical technique here, advance your pawns, create a passed pawn, use it as a decoy, and then try to win the queenside pawns. It's the same thing that you would do in king and pawn endgames. However, if we go to this position right here, this is more tricky. It's still better for the white pieces, but now it gets a little bit more difficult because the earlier position, this position is plus 3.7, so completely winning for the white pieces. But this position right here is plus 1.2, and this position is just significantly more difficult to win. It is still better though for the white pieces. White is up a pawn, and you still have to be very precise as the black pieces. However, if instead of 4 on 3, we change the position a little bit and get 3 on 2, now this position is significantly more difficult to win than the previous position. So once again, the point I'm trying to make here is that the more pawns that there are on the board, the easier it is to win the game. So make sure that in positions like this, you trade the knights, or you try to trade the knights as the white pieces, with the black pieces try to keep the knights on the board, and try to not trade any pawns and not allow your opponent to sort of get to a drawn position. So that's what I wanted to talk about today, and this is going to be a shorter video because the knight endgames are not as complicated as some of the other ones, for example, the rook endgames. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Check out some of my other endgame videos, and I will see you in the next one. Peace!